This evening, I'd like to begin by reading a couple of things from the old Pali texts, the old suttas. I don't bring in the old texts very often, but there's a lot of wisdom to be had in them. And so I want to start with a reading here, a couple of readings. And so here's the first one. Um, this is the Buddha speaking. By the way, for those of you who, in case you're interested in suttas, you don't have to be interested in suttas, but some of you may. This is from what's called the Sutta Nipata, one of the oldest of the collections of sayings. Having released knots, a sage here in the world does not follow any faction when disputes arise. Calmed among those who are not calm, he does not take up opinions saying, let others give them up. Giving up old, and I'm going to paraphrase here because the language is a little awkward, but giving up old, we'll say mental attitudes or mental formations and not forming new ones. He does not go according to his wishes. He is not dogmatic. He is completely released from views. Well, that's kind of odd, really. Completely released from views, and he is wise. He does not cling to the world and does not reproach himself. There are many places, I'm going to read another in just a moment, where the Buddha talks about, he didn't use the word to be in contention or non-contention, but that's what's being pointed to here, not being in contention with anything. And it gets talked about a lot. And I think it's easily misunderstood, but I think if we can hold it with the right attitude, it can actually be quite useful and quite instructive. But we hear here, often it's very common and understandable. People would hear this idea of not holding to any views. What do we mean we don't have any views? Certainly we've got opinions about things. Just look at what's going on in the world. There's lots of things, and I bet all of us have ideas about them, opinions about them. We talk often about how politically divided and culturally divided our country is. And of course, you can go through the whole world. I'm just focusing just in our country here. Look what's going on, especially it's been really for probably since the founding of our country, but certainly in recent weeks, a real intensifying around discussions and consciousness and conflict around racial issues. And people have lots of views, opinions. They come at it with a lot of attitudes, and I'm sure we all do. So we want to be careful. I don't think the Buddha is saying that we don't care about anything, or in a certain way that we don't have any opinions about anything. There are certainly many places in the old text where the Buddha seems to be quite opinionated, and he was he was not hesitant to share his opinions. And there's many stories where he comes to people, whether they're rulers, kings and queens, or whether they're common people, and he would say, you shouldn't act like that, you should act like this. So what is he getting at here when he's saying being freed from views? So let me bring in one more, just a moment here. Let me find one more piece I want to read. And I think it will help clarify, and then hopefully you can see for yourself when you reflect on these teachings, if and how they might be useful for you. Again, if for those interested in the suttas, I'm reading for what's called the middle length discourses, called Majjhima Nikaya in Pali, and it's the sutta number 18. And this is a story where someone came to the Buddha and just said, what is your teaching? And I'm going to read this paragraph, and I think some of it will make sense, but some of it can be a little cryptic or hard to understand. But then the rest of the sutta goes on to explain. So I'm not going to read the whole sutta, but I just want to read this and then try to tease apart a few of the things that are being said here. So this person asked the Buddha, what are your teachings? He says, Uh, I assert and proclaim my teaching in such a way that one does not quarrel with anyone in the world. In this generation with princes and common people, and he says with gods and Brahmins, and he just lists all these different types of beings. And then, so he says, you don't quarrel with anyone in the world. And then he says, and this is the part that we'll come back to, in such a way that they're no more, I'm going to paraphrase here a little, but they're no longer being driven by or at the effect of perceptions. What does that mean? They live in such a way that they're not, and perceptions don't underlie their actions, basically. And then he says they're not caught in sensual pleasures. They're free of any perplexity and free of craving for any kind. So that's what he says. So to understand this, again, he's talking about not quarreling with anyone, and then underneath that he's talking about this not being driven by or caught up in perceptions. So let's just back up for a moment, because I see what is being talked about here by perceptions. Perception is a word. This is that's in Pali it's sanya, so it gets translated as perceptions, but it has a very specific meaning that's different than perhaps some of our common connotations that we have in our culture today and everyday usage. I don't know why this particular translation, but it's the common word that's used to translate this word in Pali. So let's back up. I'll just tell you to get at what perception is. It reminds me of a story that many of you know who Joseph Goldstein is, very well known, one of the most oldest and senior teachers in our Buddhist tradition. And he tells a story that someone came to him and said that they had been in their home one spring. They had a basement, and I think from the kitchen the stairs went down to the basement, and they heard it must have been a bird had gotten in and created a nest, and they could hear the bird chirping, and they got so much enjoyment and happiness listening to the bird chirp in the basement. They would leave the door open so they could hear the bird chirping. And then they said one day a repair person came to do some work in the basement and came up and said, the battery, you need to replace the battery in your smoke detector down in your basement. It's going off and chirping. And that's what had been. There was no bird in the basement. All along it had been the smoke detector going off. So easy mistake to make, but the point is this gets to what we mean by perception, because it hadn't occurred to them. They just heard a sound. Their mind created the reality of what it was. They made the sound to be of a bird. It turned out, in that case, to be inaccurate. So perception is this idea that we're all having just all the experiences we have of being a human being, being alive. We can see things, hear things, feel things in our bodies. There's smells and tastes, and we can think things. So there's this whole world of experience. And then what the mind does is it takes all this raw sense input and it creates it into what we say is our experience. And to give you another example, I'll clarify a little more in a moment. I'm going to hold this up so hopefully you can see in the camera. There it is. This is a bell. I rang it at the end of the sit. And sometimes some of you have heard me do this, but I think it makes the point very clearly about what we mean by perception. So I ask people, I'll say, well, what is this? And people will answer. They'll say, well, it's a bowl or a bell. I say, what do you see? But it's a trick question, because that's what we would all answer. And that is true on a certain level, but actually you don't see a bowl or a bell. What's landing on the retina of your eye are, what would we say, colors, shapes, shades of, and then in your mind, your mind assembles this into a reality that we call bowl. So I'm not making any ontological statements about what's really can be known about, of reality or anything like that. There are whole philosophical schools that spend a lot of time on that. I'm just pointing out the function, and we're not doing anything wrong. This is a function of being a human being. If you're going to function in the world when this particular shadows and shapes and color lands on your retina, you need to know that it's a bell, right? If you, for those of you, if you pay attention to, I'm just noticing for myself, I'm sitting in an office, and as I see the video of myself, behind me there's two doors. I see bookshelf, chair, filing cabinet, there's a wooden floor, you can see these things. I can see a few of the thumbnails for those of you who got your video on, different things in your behind you. And so just using that as an example, you don't, if you look at me and look behind me, you don't, I mean, you do see a door, but you actually, I won't beat this to death, but one more time, what's landing is just shape and color, and that's it. You create door. Now there may really be a door there again, that's not my point. We create our experience of the world. Sometimes people say we create the world. I think that I'm not going to go that far myself, but we do create our experience of the world. And that's the point, that we are creating our experience of the world. And it's happening all the time. There's nothing wrong. It's part of being a human being, right? I don't think you can stop. Maybe you wouldn't want to stop doing it. I mean, if you start paying attention to this too much, you can drive yourself crazy. We don't want to do that. Just relax, live, don't make a big deal, except for one thing. We tend to get, and this is what the Buddha is pointing to, we get into a lot of trouble because we make up, sometimes the way they say it, we make up stories about things. We add meaning to things that may or may not be an accurate representation of what's really happening. And we don't see that we bring our own meaning, our own overlay. So between ourselves and what's happening, there can be this invisible filter that we aren't even aware of that's changing in some way. We add our own overlay so that what we receive is maybe not what's happening. I'll give you another example. For many years, I used to teach meditation in the state prisons. I did it for a long, long time. And I remember for a while I was teaching in San Quentin prison. That was back when it was, I think it's a level 2 now. That's back when it was serious, well, still a serious place, but it's a level 4 prison. And one guy I knew there got into trouble because he got in a fight with one of the other prisoners. And what had happened was, from this guy's perspective, the other prisoner just sprang up and started, hitting him, attacking him. And then he defended himself. And it turned out that the prisoner said the guy I was speaking with had disrespected him. The guy I was talking to, who was part of our meditation group and that we had going, he said, I was just walking. I don't even remember looking at the guy. He didn't have anything going on in his mind at all. The person sitting down who sprang up and started the fight saw him walk by and look at him a certain way that the person talking to me wasn't even aware he even looked at the guy. Looked at him in a certain way and felt disrespected. He created the whole thing in his mind. It wasn't even real. But it was real to him in that moment. Right? It wouldn't have occurred to him that, well, wait a minute, hang on a second. Does he even know he's looked at me or not? This kind of thing goes on and on. I'll just give you one last example. We can't even see all the different levels of this. Once I was in Las Vegas once. I was doing like a weekend retreat or something like that, meditation group. And the people who were hosting me, it was quite early in the morning. We were driving. It was very, very early in the morning. Hardly any cars were out. And we pulled up at a stoplight, and someone else pulled up few lanes over, and a young woman, and opened the door and was throwing up onto the street. So it was so early in the morning, I just said, too much partying. She'd been maybe, our day was just starting. I just assumed her day was probably ending, up all night, too much drinking, partying. And the person I was driving with said, yeah, or could be morning sickness. Maybe she's on chemotherapy, ill, and here I'm there as the teacher, right? But I appreciated him teaching me. It's like, oh yeah, it could be many, many things. There it was again. I just created a reality. Now, that's a case that's pretty benign, right? So the problem is, if we're not careful and mindful and aware of what we're doing, these forces carry with us, and it leads to a lot of conflict and a lot of suffering. And so this is what the Buddha is getting back to. This is what he says, talking about freeing yourself from these perceptions that underlie our experience. That's what he's talking about, being freed from those things. I don't know if he meant the process. I can't believe that he means the process of that we're calling perception here is not happening. There are people who, either through disease or maybe injuries, brain injuries, lose that ability to assemble the world into something. And people have come back from that and they basically have lost connection with the world. So raw sense input's still coming in, but they can't assemble it into, oh, that's a person, I'm in a room, I'm me. It's just raw sense input coming in. And that's something that can happen to people. People have come back and described that. You could probably find people talking about it if you did a web search about that. So these things can happen. So of course, in order to be a human being who functions what we call normally in the world, you have to have this process. What we don't want, though, is to be driven unconsciously by our interactions with others and the choices and the decisions we make. So this then gets back to, I'm going to wrap up here in just a bit. There's three things I think come together here. One is this idea of, I'll go back to the original reading I did from the Sutta Nipat, which is not being caught in views, but it was more about clinging to our views. It doesn't mean we don't have any sense of right or wrong, or justice, or care for others. If we care about suffering, if we care about our own suffering, and if we care about the suffering of others, then we want to know certainly our own actions, if there's ways that we're acting or being that perhaps we hadn't been aware of. It had been a blind spot of ours, right? Or something that we haven't seen. You want to know. And we do care. It's not that we don't care about that. We want to know what leads to suffering and also what leads to more happiness and well-being. And we have, you could say, opinions or views about that. That's not what's being talked about here. It's all the, how would I say, non-helpful, suffering-generating views and opinions, which takes up, for most of, probably all of us, I'll put myself in there, all of us, all of human beings, a lot of how we can get into conflicts. And so isn't a real, well, let me come back to this in a minute. It's a real difference, because he's talking about here also not only about not being in contention with things, but also it's real, and not, and as much as we can, being aware when we're creating a meaning or story that we're adding on as something extra to what's happening. An easy example is that's very accessible, if we can remember, is just if you did nothing else but remind yourself that when someone does something, we don't assume we know their motivation. Sometimes you do know their motivation, fine. But if we, I found it to be very helpful that if I can, rather than get reactive over what the person did or didn't do, or how they're judging them by their actions, if I just pause long enough, I may come back to maybe I do need to judge their actions. Believe me, don't, I've gotten a lot of, many of you have heard, I've gotten a lot of Dharma talks in the last 3.5 years in my own work, which is a work in progress or process of learning to not have my heart close off with, say, some of our, I don't know everybody's politics, so I'll just say this, some of our political leaders who I find challenging. I'll just say it like that. Some of you heard I've given many Dharma talks about how I'm trying to work with it because it can be challenging. So it's not that I don't have any views about things, but I found it very helpful, and I'll offer this to you if you find it useful, is to pause and just ask the question, what might be going on in someone to cause them to act this way? And I've found just by asking that question, it kind of softens and it steps me out of the story of, well, I already know everything. I know what the reason. I may not be consciously articulating it, but that's what's going on. Well, I know why this person's that way because they're this, they're that, whatever, which may be true. But by asking the question, it steps me back, has me pause, and then I can connect with, well, are there places where I'm adding a story here or not? Or can I really, where I end up landing is, what is it like just to be present with this to start with before I make a decision on how to respond? Hopefully then that gives me at least the potential of being able to have a wise response rather than a reaction, right? Those are different. You can react to something and you can respond to something. Different feeling there, right? This is getting more to what the Buddha's talking about. And then similarly, this thing not caught up in sense pleasures, free from craving. What he's talking about is not being jerked around by our likes and dislikes. And that's a whole topic that we talk about often in the Dharma world. So I don't have much time left, so won't go into that. But clearly it's about being driven by our likes and dislikes. And when things are difficult, unpleasant, we get into conflict with them. When things are to our liking, okay, we're happy, we want more of that. It's that kind of thing. So then where this all lands for me then is so I'm offering this as a question. It's not for me to sit here and give you an answer, but I'm just posing it for something, and you can see if this is of interest for you to, you may already know your answer, or interest for you to explore is, in any situation in life, you might think generally, or there may be specific situations that come to mind, what might be possible in the way I come to meet that situation or I respond to a situation if I'm not being knocked around, jostled, and caught by my reactivity, my likes and my dislikes, the stories I create, all of these things we're talking about here. If we can start to soften the grip of those, or at least a little bit, we talk about mindfulness a lot. It gets kind of a cliche, on and on, but to bring some awareness, mindfulness, some presence, wakefulness to what's happening. Then what I have found for myself, and I think many people find, is it doesn't mean we stop caring or we don't take action or we don't make changes. Just going back, I said something a little bit ago about political action. We each have to find our own response to what's going on, whether things you like or don't like, and how you choose to respond. I've tended not to be that politically oriented of a person, but I have been in recent times, and I have taken some actions. I've tried to do some get out the vote things, and I contribute to certain things. I'm trying to do something. So I've found for myself, and around the whole thing that's come up about with George Floyd being killed in the last few weeks, and all the protests and the rioting and everything that's been going on in there. And so, I've tried to, I've actually, there's an interesting book that I have on order that I'm going to read called My Grandmother's Hands. You may have heard about it. It's a Black psychotherapist, and he does a lot about talking about white and Black trauma and sort of, anyway, I think he's trying to get into racial tensions in a real skillful way. So, you may or may not want to do that for yourself, but I've decided I'd like to explore this a little bit. My point is, I have found that to the extent I can be as free as I can of these reactive forces, I actually find that I'm more able to then move into whatever action or inaction it may be. I don't have. There's no have to here. Each find our own way in relationship to anything, whether it's people I live with, my immediate neighborhood, the wider community, the world. So I find that if we're able to free ourselves, getting back to being in non-contention with things, I think another way of saying that is disentangling from our habitual, unconscious, reactive stances might be another way. Then I can be more present with things. I'm more aware of my reactivity, and I can make more wise choices. So I think this is what's being pointed to. So just to wrap up, this idea of not being in contention with anything, coming as an attitude, not to be confused, I'm just summarizing here, not to be confused for not caring, being numb or indifferent. I think it's actually quite the opposite. And so then the question for all of us is, if we're interested in these kind of teachings, and there's many, many more. I could, if you want to contact me, I can point you to even more places where the Buddha speaks about this a lot. Freeing ourselves from views and opinions. Again, from the clinging to our views and opinions, I think. It's not that you don't have them, but it's how do we hold them? And do I think I know everything, or do I have some openness maybe to listen to somebody else? I've shared here, I have, many of you who know me, my politics, I'm a pretty liberal person, and I have two brothers, I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and my family's in the South, and my two brothers are Trump supporters. I've had many interesting conversations. There might have been a few raised voices here and there. Some of you have heard me talk about it a little bit, so that can happen. I don't know if we were laughing at the time, but we're all good now. But you know, I found that the times when we could sit and just say, "Look, you think this, I don't get it," and they say to me, "Okay, you really view it like this? I don't get it." And then we've actually had this conversation. Say, what you see this? What is your thinking? How? Let me tell you mine, and let's really try to do it in a way. Let's set it up consciously ahead of time so that we don't end up in an argument and trigger each other off. Be aware it can happen. So let's try not to have that, because I really want to hear your perspective, but I want you to hear me too. And when the times, I'm not saying it was perfect, but the times when we could do that, that's a place of being in non-contention. I still think they're wrong as wrong can be, you know, and you know, their up is my down in some ways. But to approach it from being in non-contention, then I don't have to shut them out of my heart. But I'm still going to work for what I think is right, and so that's kind of the idea. So.